The radio operator heard the shot before anyone else understood what had happened. A single crack, distant and clean, rolling across the canopy like the snap of a dry branch in a cathedral, then silence. The kind of silence that should not exist on a battlefield where 300 North Vietnamese regulars were advancing through the rubber trees toward an Australian fire support base that held fewer than 80 men. The column had been moving with purpose, 3 companies abreast, their battalion commander walking upright among his staff officers because he believed the Australians had no idea he was coming. He was wrong. Somewhere in the green tangle 600 meters to the northwest, an Australian SAS trooper had been lying motionless for 11 hours, his body pressed into a depression in the earth so shallow it would not have hidden a sleeping dog. He had watched the column form. He had counted rifles. He had identified the officer whose gestures and position marked him as the man giving orders. And when that officer paused at a trail junction to consult a map held by his adjutant, the Australian squeezed the trigger of his L1A1 and sent a single 7.62 millimeter round across 600 meters of humid air and into the base of the officer's throat. The battalion commander dropped where he stood. His adjutant looked down at the body and then looked up at the jungle and saw nothing. No muzzle flash, no smoke, no second shot. Just the trees and the silence and the unmistakable reality that their commander was dead and nobody knew where the bullet had come from. What happened in the next 47 minutes did not just save a fire base. It unraveled an entire North Vietnamese offensive timetable in Phuoc Tuy Province and demonstrated in the starkest possible terms why the Viet Cong and the People's Army of Vietnam gave the Australian SAS a name they gave to no other Western force, Ma Rung, the Jungle Ghosts. But to understand how one bullet fired by one man lying in the dirt could accomplish what battalions of infantry and squadrons of aircraft could not, we need to go back further. We need to understand the war the Australians were fighting, why they fought it differently from everyone else, and what made the men who pulled triggers like that one fundamentally unlike any other soldiers in Vietnam. In April of 1966, the 1st Australian Task Force established its base at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province, roughly 70 kilometers southeast of Saigon. The Australians had negotiated something remarkable with the American command. Rather than being attached to a United States division and fed into the American meat grinder of search and destroy operations, the Australians secured their own province, their own area of operations, their own war, fought on their own terms. The terms were different from anything the Americans were doing. Where American strategy measured success in body counts, territory seized and held for a news cycle, and the sheer tonnage of ordnance dropped on suspected enemy positions, the Australian mandate was deceptively simple: pacify Phuoc Tuy Province. The methods were left to Australian discretion, and the Australians chose methods that mystified, irritated, and ultimately humiliated their American allies. At the heart of the Australian approach was the Special Air Service Regiment, 3 squadrons rotating through Vietnam, never more than 150 operators in country at any given time. They were based at Nui Dat, alongside the infantry battalions, but their war existed in a different dimension entirely. They operated in 5-man patrols. They moved through jungle so slowly that American observers who accompanied them reported feeling as though time itself had decelerated. They went out for days, sometimes weeks, without firing a shot. They came back with intelligence that changed the shape of operations across the entire province, and they came back alive. The statistics were difficult to argue with, and American commanders spent years trying. Between 1966 and 1971, the Australian SAS conducted approximately 1,200 combat patrols. Their losses were staggeringly low. 1 man killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 killed accidentally, 1 missing in action, 1 dead from illness, 28 wounded. Against those numbers, the SAS accounted for roughly 600 confirmed enemy dead. The kill ratio was the highest of any unit, Australian or American, in the entire Vietnam War. These were not men who avoided contact. These were men who controlled it absolutely, who dictated when, where, and how every engagement would unfold. The enemy never chose the terms. The Australians always did, and the single most devastating tool in their arsenal was not the modified rifle, not the claymore mine, not the artillery they could call with pinpoint accuracy. It was patience. To understand Australian patience, you had to watch them prepare for a patrol. The preparation began weeks before insertion. Australian SAS troopers stopped using soap, deodorant, and commercial toothpaste 14 days before any operation. They ceased using American cigarettes, switching to local tobacco, or quitting entirely. Some ate indigenous food, including fermented fish sauce, which altered the chemical composition of their sweat and breath. By insertion day, they carried no scent that did not belong to the jungle itself. This was not eccentricity. This was survival doctrine born from hard intelligence. Captured Viet Cong fighters confirmed in interrogation after interrogation that American patrols could be detected by smell from distances exceeding 500 meters. The chemical signature of American hygiene products was alien to the jungle environment. Deodorant created scent trails that lingered for hours in the saturated tropical air. Insect repellent contained compounds detectable at extraordinary distances. The sweet Virginia tobacco of American cigarettes announced patrol positions to any enemy scout within a kilometer. The Australians eliminated every one of these markers. The result was documented in classified reports that American commanders struggled to accept. Viet Cong patrols routinely passed within meters of concealed Australian positions without detecting anything unusual. The Australians did not merely blend into the jungle, they became indistinguishable from it. Then there was the movement. American Special Operations units conducting long-range reconnaissance in Vietnam moved at 2 to 3 kilometers per day. This was considered a reasonable balance between caution and operational tempo. The Australian SAS moved at 100 to 200 meters per hour. When American observers first heard this figure, they assumed a translation error. 100 meters per hour meant that covering a single kilometer required an entire day. A 5-kilometer mission would consume the better part of a week. It was not a translation error. It was the foundation of everything. At that speed, no acoustic signature existed. The jungle soundscape recovered completely between movements. Birds continued singing. Insects continued their drone. Monkeys kept calling. To enemy listening posts trained to detect the snap of a twig or the rustle of disturbed vegetation, areas where Australian patrols operated sounded perfectly normal. There was nothing to investigate, nothing to report, nothing to ambush, but slowness provided something beyond concealment. It transformed the Australians from potential prey into apex predators. Moving at 100 meters per hour, they detected enemy activity long before being detected themselves. Viet Cong patrols moving at normal speeds created exactly the disturbances that Australians had spent years training to recognize. A patrol that had spent 4 hours listening to a single stretch of jungle could identify approaching enemy movement from distances that seemed almost supernatural. The hunters became the hunted without ever knowing the roles had reversed. This was the ecosystem in which Australian snipers operated, not as isolated marksmen perched on hilltops waiting for targets of opportunity, the way popular imagination envisions the sniper's craft. Australian SAS snipers were integrated into the 5-man patrol system. They moved at the same agonizing pace. They smelled like the same jungle rot. They wore the same Ho Chi Minh sandals cut from automobile tires that left tracks indistinguishable from Viet Cong movement. They endured the same days of absolute stillness, the same suppression of every human impulse that might betray position. But they carried a different weapon, tuned to a different purpose. While most SAS troopers in Vietnam carried the modified L1A1 that they called the Bitch, a barrel-shortened, full-auto-converted close-quarters beast designed for the 15-meter engagement ranges of dense jungle. The designated marksman within a patrol retained the full-length L1A1 or, in some cases, a scoped variant. The Bitch deserves its own explanation because it reveals how completely the Australians had rejected conventional military thinking. The standard L1A1 self-loading rifle was a variant of the legendary Belgian FNFAL, one of the finest battle rifles ever manufactured. It was accurate to 400 meters, reliable in tropical conditions, respected by militaries across 3 continents. The Australians took it into their armory and destroyed it, or so American ordnance specialists believed. SAS armorers cut the barrel off at the front sight post, sometimes removing as much as 15 centimeters of precision machined steel. They filed down the selector mechanism to enable fully automatic fire. They removed the bipod from the heavy-barreled L2A1 variant and added a cone-shaped flash hider and a forward pistol grip made from scrap metal or carved hardwood. Some even mounted American XM148 40mm grenade launchers beneath the shortened barrel, creating a combination weapon that looked like something assembled in a guerrilla workshop. American weapons inspectors who examined these modifications were appalled. The ballistics were ruined. The effective range had been slashed. The resulting weapon was loud, flashy, and profoundly inaccurate beyond close range. The Australians did not care about range. In the triple canopy jungle where they operated, average visibility was between 10 and 15 meters. A rifle accurate to 400 meters was dead weight when you could not see past 15. Worse, the full-length barrel constantly snagged on vines, bamboo, and undergrowth. Every snag meant stopping. Every stop meant noise. Every noise could mean detection and death. The Bitch slid through vegetation like a snake, and the 7.62mm NATO round, even from a shortened barrel, delivered stopping power at close range that the American 5.56mm M16 round could not match. The M16's smaller, faster projectile had a tendency to wound rather than incapacitate at jungle distances. The 7.62 round from the Bitch did not wound. It ended conversations. But not every conversation in the jungle was conducted at 15 meters. Some required reaching out across hundreds of meters of rubber plantation or open trail. Some required the kind of precision that a sawed-off automatic weapon could never deliver. For those conversations, the patrol's designated marksman carried the tool designed for a different kind of killing, not the explosive ambush that lasted 4 seconds. The single, deliberate shot that changed an entire tactical situation from 400, 500, or 600 meters away. The philosophy was precision as psychological warfare. One shot, no follow-up, no indication of where it came from. The target drops. His comrades look around and see nothing. They hear one report echoing off the canopy and cannot determine direction. They do not know if they are facing a single shooter or the leading edge of an ambush. They do not know if the next shot is coming in 1 second or 1 hour. They do not know anything at all, and that uncertainty is more paralyzing than any volume of automatic fire. The specific engagement that demonstrated the full devastating potential of this doctrine occurred during a period when the North Vietnamese were attempting to reassert control over portions of Phuoc Tuy Province. The province had been a Viet Cong stronghold before the Australians arrived. The VC 5th Division, comprising the 274th and 275th Regiments, along with the provincial D445 Battalion, had operated there with near impunity. The Australians' arrival in 1966 began a slow, grinding campaign to strip that control away, village by village, trail by trail, ambush by ambush. The Australians had already proven what they could do when outnumbered. In August 1966, barely 4 months after establishing their base, a single company from the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, found itself engaged by a regimental-strength Viet Cong force in a rubber plantation near the village of Long Tan. 108 Australians against an estimated 1,500 to 2,500 enemy fighters. The battle raged through a tropical downpour that turned the plantation floor into a lake of red mud. Visibility collapsed to meters. Radio communications crackled and died in the storm. Ammunition ran low. Wounded men lay in water that rose around their bodies as the rain intensified. The Australians held their ground for hours, sustained by artillery fire so close that shell fragments struck friendly positions, and by ammunition resupplied from armored personnel carriers that smashed through the plantation to reach them in the failing light. When it was over, 18 Australians were dead and 24 wounded. The enemy left at least 245 confirmed dead on the field, with actual losses estimated to be far higher. Long Tan established a reality that the Viet Cong would never fully overcome. The Australians could be outnumbered 20-1 and still hold their ground and inflict catastrophic casualties. The battle gave the Australians dominance over Phuoc Tuy Province, a dominance they would never be fundamentally challenged on again. But dominance is not permanence, and the enemy was not static. By 1968, the province was contested ground. The Tet Offensive in January and February of that year had thrown the entire Allied position in Vietnam into chaos. While the offensive ultimately proved a tactical catastrophe for the Communists, costing them an estimated 45,000 dead, it served as a strategic victory by shattering American and Allied confidence. In the aftermath, North Vietnamese commanders sought to exploit the disruption. In Phuoc Tuy, this meant pushing fresh forces back into areas the Australians had spent 2 years pacifying. The NVA 33rd Regiment and elements of the 274th VC Regiment began infiltrating from their sanctuaries in Long Can Province, moving south along jungle trails toward the population centers the Australians were sworn to protect. Intelligence indicated a coordinated push designed to overwhelm isolated Australian positions and demonstrate that Phuoc Tuy was not as secure as Allied briefings claimed. The Australian SAS was deployed to do what it always did: find the enemy, map his movements, understand his intentions, provide the intelligence that would allow the infantry battalions and their supporting Centurion tanks and artillery batteries to be in the right place at the right time. Multiple five-man patrols were inserted by helicopter into the jungle approaches north and northeast of Nui Dat. They were dropped using the standard Australian technique, the helicopter touching down at multiple points during a single flight to disguise which location actually received the patrol. The method demanded pilots willing to land repeatedly in potentially hostile clearings, creating the illusion of activity across a wide area, while the actual insertion point remained unknown to enemy observers. One of these patrols moved into an area of mixed rubber plantation and secondary jungle approximately 12 kilometers northeast of the Australian base. Their orders were reconnaissance. Find the enemy column that signals intelligence suggested was moving south. Determine its size, composition, and likely route of advance. Report. Do not engage unless compromised. 3 days of movement at standard SAS pace brought the patrol to a position overlooking a trail junction where two paths converged before continuing south toward a series of hamlets that the Australians had been working to secure for months. The patrol settled into a concealed observation point and waited. They did not dig in. They did not clear fields of fire. They arranged themselves among the existing vegetation and root systems in positions so well integrated with the terrain that a man could have walked within 2 meters without seeing them. The designated marksman in the patrol positioned himself with care that bordered on ritual. He selected a natural depression that gave him a clear line of sight down the trail for approximately 650 meters in one direction and 400 meters in another. He placed his rifle, a standard-issue L1A1 with a scope, into a rest formed by the junction of 2 exposed roots. He arranged vegetation to break the outline of his body and the barrel. He checked the wind, such as it was beneath the canopy, by watching the drift of insects and the movement of the lightest leaves. Then he settled in to wait. 11 hours passed, 11 hours of absolute stillness. No shifting position to ease cramped muscles, no reaching for a water canteen, no swatting at the insects that crawled across exposed skin. 11 hours of watching and listening with the focused intensity that Australian SAS selection had identified, and Australian SAS training had refined into something that transcended normal human capability. Australian SAS selection was designed to find men with a specific psychological profile, high pain tolerance, low need for social validation, above-average pattern recognition, and what military psychologists described as predatory patience, the ability to remain motionless and alert for periods that would drive most human beings to madness. Only 1 in 12 candidates who began selection completed it. Those who passed entered a training pipeline that lasted 18 months, 3 times the length of American Special Forces training of the same era. A significant portion of that training occurred in the Australian outback, learning tracking and observation techniques from Aboriginal instructors whose methods had never been written down but had been refined across 40,000 years of survival in some of the most demanding environments on Earth. The men who emerged from this process were not merely well-trained soldiers. They were something different. They could read a landscape the way literate people read books. They could detect human presence through absence, noticing when birds had stopped calling or insects had gone silent in ways that indicated intrusion. They could remain so still, so free of the micro-movements and unconscious behavioral signals that even a sleeping person generates, that enemy scouts could look directly at their position and register nothing but undisturbed jungle. It was this kind of man who lay in the depression for 11 hours watching the trail until the North Vietnamese column appeared. They came from the northeast, moving with the disciplined spacing of regular army troops, not the loose, opportunistic movement of local Viet Cong guerrillas. These were soldiers from an NVA regiment trained in the north, hardened on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, equipped with AK-47 assault rifles and RPG-7 rocket launchers, and the unshakable conviction that they were winning a righteous war of liberation. They moved through the rubber plantation in a formation that suggested confidence. They were on a schedule. They had an objective. They had been told correctly that Australian forces in their path were thin on the ground and spread across a wide area. The patrol commander made his count. The column numbered approximately 300, a reinforced battalion moving as a coherent unit. This was not a supply party or a courier team. This was an assault force moving toward a specific target. The radio operator began composing the contact report that would alert Australian headquarters to the threat. But the marksman had seen something else. Walking near the center of the column, flanked by 2 men carrying radio sets and a third holding a map case, was an officer whose bearing and position within the formation identified him unmistakably as the battalion commander. This was the man directing the movement, the man who held the operational plan in his head, the man whose decisions in the next several hours would determine whether 300 armed soldiers hit their target with coordinated precision or stumbled into confusion. The marksman communicated his observation to the patrol commander through the system of touches and whispers that replaced normal speech on Australian patrols. A conversation that would have taken 30 seconds in spoken English was conducted in micro-gestures over 2 minutes. The patrol commander faced a decision that distilled the entire Australian approach to warfare into a single moment. His orders were to observe and report, not engage. A 5-man patrol initiating contact with a 300-man battalion was suicide by every conventional calculation, but the Australian SAS did not operate by conventional calculations. The mathematics were brutal. If the column continued south unmolested, it would reach the line of hamlets the Australians had spent months securing within 6 hours. The nearest infantry response force was a company from the Royal Australian Regiment at a fire support base 8 kilometers away. Even with helicopter support, assembling a blocking force would take time the situation might not allow. But if the column's commander was removed, the immediate effect would be uncertainty, hesitation, a pause in the advance, while subordinate officers sorted out who was in charge and whether their orders still applied. One shot could buy hours. Hours the infantry needed to reposition, hours the artillery needed to register fire coordinates, hours that would transform a potential disaster into a controlled engagement where Australian advantages in firepower and preparation could be brought to bear. The patrol commander authorized the shot. The marksman had been tracking the officer for 7 minutes, watching him move through his scope, calculating the range, accounting for the slight angle of declination from his elevated position, reading the almost imperceptible drift of air through the plantation. At 600 meters, the 7.62 millimeter NATO round, fired from a standard L1A1, was approaching the outer edge of its effective envelope. This was not a weapon designed for precision sniping at extended range. It was a battle rifle, reliable and powerful, but lacking the specialized optics and match-grade ammunition that dedicated sniper systems employed. The shot demanded skill that compensated for the limitations of the equipment. The officer paused at the trail junction. His adjutant held the map open. The officer bent slightly to study it. For perhaps 3 seconds, his upper body was stationary. The marksman exhaled half a breath, settled the crosshairs, and pressed the trigger. The round covered 600 meters in approximately 0.7 of a second. It struck the officer at the base of the throat, just above the collar of his uniform. He collapsed without a sound that carried back to the Australian position. The adjutant stood frozen, map still extended. The 2 radio operators looked at each other. The soldiers nearest the fallen officer stopped walking and stared down at a dead man they could not explain. The marksman did not fire again. He did not adjust his position. He did not chamber another round. He lay absolutely motionless in his depression and waited. What followed was a textbook demonstration of why the Australians valued the single precision shot above all other forms of engagement. The NVA column did not react the way it would have reacted to an ambush. There was no burst of automatic fire to orient toward. There was no explosion to suggest a mine or booby trap. There was one dead officer and silence. The column stopped. Soldiers took cover behind rubber trees and in drainage ditches along the trail. Officers and sergeants began shouting, but their shouts contradicted each other because nobody could identify the threat. Some pointed north, believing the shot had come from that direction. Others pointed west. A few fired bursts into the jungle at nothing in particular, the instinctive response of frightened men who needed the reassurance of their own weapons making noise. The patrol's radio operator transmitted a contact report to headquarters. The message was terse and devastating. Enemy battalion, approximately 300 strength. Grid reference followed. Moving south on trail junction. Commander eliminated by sniper fire. Column halted, requesting immediate artillery registration on trail approaches and infantry reinforcement to blocking positions. The response from Australian headquarters was immediate. Artillery at Nui Dat began registering fire coordinates along the trail routes the enemy column would have to use if it resumed its advance. An infantry company was alerted for helicopter deployment to positions south of the column's projected route. Additional SAS patrols in the area were reoriented to provide ongoing surveillance. Meanwhile, the NVA column sat motionless on the trail, bleeding time. 47 minutes passed before the column began moving again, and when it did, its character had fundamentally changed. The confident, purposeful advance had become a cautious, halting movement. The new officer in charge, whoever he was, did not know what had happened to his predecessor. He did not know if the shot had been a lone sniper or the prelude to an ambush. He did not know if the trail ahead was mined, if artillery was registered on his position, if his movement was being observed at that exact moment. He knew nothing, and that nothing governed every decision he made for the next several hours. He slowed the column's pace. He sent scouts ahead, which cost more time. He diverted from the planned route, swinging west to avoid the trail junction where his commander had fallen. The diversion added 3 kilometers to the march and pushed the column through denser vegetation that further reduced speed. By the time the NVA force approached its original objective, it was nearly 5 hours behind schedule, and the world it walked into was no longer the one its dead commander had planned for. The Australian Infantry Company was in position, dug in along a tree line with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery at Nui Dat had pre-registered fire missions on every approach. Additional SAS patrols had established observation points that provided real-time intelligence on the column's movement. The trap was set, and the NVA walked into it, as though guided by invisible hands. The engagement that followed was sharp, violent, and one-sided. Artillery caught elements of the column in the open as they crossed between tree lines. The infantry company engaged from prepared positions at ranges the NVA had not expected. Without the coordinated leadership their battalion commander would have provided, the NVA assault degenerated into a series of uncoordinated rushes that were broken up by disciplined Australian fire and accurate artillery. Within 2 hours, the NVA force was withdrawing northward, leaving its dead and wounded on the trail. The advance into Phuoc Tuy had been stopped, not by a regiment, not by an airstrike, not by a B-52 arc-light bombing mission, by one bullet fired by one man who had lain in the dirt for 11 hours, waiting for the right 3 seconds to present themselves. The 5-man patrol, meanwhile, remained in its concealed position throughout the engagement that unfolded below. They watched the artillery strikes. They listened to the distant rattle of small arms fire as the infantry company engaged the disorganized NVA force. They continued reporting the enemy's movements, providing real-time intelligence that allowed the artillery controllers to adjust fire as the NVA attempted to find routes around the blocking positions. When elements of the column tried to swing east through denser jungle to bypass the Australian ambush, it was the SAS patrol's report that redirected fire onto the new axis of advance. When survivors attempted to regroup at a secondary rally point 2 kilometers north of the initial contact, the patrol identified the concentration and called in another fire mission that scattered the remnants. For the entire duration of the battle, the patrol was never detected. The NVA force, even in its diminished and disorganized state, still outnumbered the 5 Australians 60-1. At any point, a flanking element stumbling onto their position could have overwhelmed them in seconds. The patrol's survival depended entirely on the same discipline that had made the sniper shot possible: absolute stillness, total integration with the environment, the suppression of every human impulse that might create a detectable signature. When the firing finally stopped and the NVA began their disordered withdrawal toward Phuoc Province, the patrol maintained its position for another 4 hours. Standard procedure. The enemy might leave stay-behind elements to observe the battlefield. He might circle back to recover dead or wounded. Patience was not a tactic the Australians employed selectively. It was the foundation of everything they did, and abandoning it because the immediate threat had passed was the kind of mistake that got men killed. The aftermath revealed the full scope of what that single shot had accomplished. Documents recovered from the dead battalion commander confirmed that the advance was part of a coordinated operation involving multiple NVA and Viet Cong units. The column's objective was to seize several hamlets along the southern approaches to the Australian area of operations, establish a temporary presence, and demonstrate to the local population that the Australians could not protect them. It was a political operation as much as a military one, designed to undermine the pacification program the Australians had been building for 2 years. The death of the battalion commander did not merely delay the column, it disrupted the entire operational timetable. Other elements of the coordinated operation, expecting the battalion to be in position at a specific time, found themselves operating without the support they had been promised. Units that were supposed to attack simultaneously arrived at their objectives at different times, allowing the Australians to deal with each threat sequentially rather than facing them all at once. Intelligence analysts estimated that the disruption caused by the single sniper kill effectively neutralized an offensive that had been months in planning. Not through attrition, not through firepower, through the surgical removal of a single mind that held the plan together. This was the Australian way of war distilled to its purest expression. Find the critical vulnerability, exploit it with minimal force, disappear before the enemy understands what has happened. The contrast with American methodology could not have been starker. In the same year, American forces conducting similar operations against NVA infiltration relied on battalion-strength sweeps, supported by artillery preparation fires and aerial bombardment. The operations were massive, expensive, and loud. They announced their presence hours before contact, giving the enemy time to prepare ambushes or melt into tunnel complexes that no amount of bombing could collapse. American units suffered casualties approaching 1-to-1 ratios against an enemy that chose where and when to fight. The Australians had inverted this dynamic entirely. They did not go looking for fights. They went looking for information, and when they found the right piece of information at the right moment, they applied force with the economy of a surgeon removing a tumor. One round, one target, one decision point eliminated, and then the larger machinery of infantry, armor, and artillery could be brought to bear against an enemy already reeling from a blow he never saw coming. It was warfare reduced to its most essential elements, not tonnage of bombs dropped, not kilometers of jungle cleared, not body counts tallied for press briefings, just 5 men in the dirt, 1 rifle with a scope, and the patience to wait for the moment when a single bullet could accomplish what a division could not. The Viet Cong and NVA had a term for the Australians that they applied to no other Western force in Vietnam: Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. The term carried connotations that went beyond ordinary military respect. It suggested something supernatural, something that could not be fought with conventional means because it did not operate within the conventional world. Captured documents from the late 1960s revealed that enemy commanders had developed entirely separate tactical guidance for engaging Australian versus American forces. The guidance for engaging Americans emphasized their predictability. Americans used helicopter insertions that created detectable noise from kilometers away. They moved at trackable speeds. They could be smelled from hundreds of meters. Their reliance on heavy supporting fires created exploitable patterns. The guidance for Australians was radically different. One word dominated the recommendations: avoidance. Do not engage Australian patrols unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush, because Australians were more likely to detect the trap before entering it. Do not attempt pursuit, because Australian counter-tracking capabilities made such efforts futile and potentially fatal. If contact was unavoidable, break it off immediately and withdraw to areas where Australian patrols were not operating. The fear had measurable tactical consequences. Enemy activity in Phuoc Tuy Province, where Australian forces concentrated, was consistently lower than in adjacent American-controlled sectors. Viet Cong units that aggressively engaged American forces in one area refused to enter Australian territory in the next. When they did enter, their behavior changed completely, becoming defensive and cautious rather than offensive and aggressive. American commanders noticed the disparity and demanded explanations. Perhaps the Australians were in less strategically important areas. Perhaps they were avoiding contact to inflate their success rates. The captured documents eliminated every alternative explanation. The enemy was explicitly instructing its forces to avoid Australian contact because Australians were more dangerous. The Viet Cong were choosing their fights, engaging where they had advantages. Against Americans, they had advantages. Against Australians, they did not. The sniper doctrine was central to this fear. The Viet Cong and NVA could process an ambush. They could understand a firefight. They had tactics for dealing with artillery and airstrikes. But a single shot from nowhere that killed a commander and then produced nothing, no follow-up, no second shot, no indication of where the shooter was or whether he was still watching, that produced a specific species of terror that had no tactical remedy. You cannot suppress a sniper you cannot see. You cannot maneuver against a position you cannot locate. You cannot retaliate against an enemy who fires one round and then ceases to exist as a detectable presence. All you can do is wonder whether the next step you take will be your last, whether the officer standing next to you is about to collapse with a hole in his throat, whether the silence of the jungle around you is natural silence or the silence of a predator preparing to strike. This was the psychological warfare that the Australians had refined into something approaching an art form. Every SAS engagement was a communication, not with headquarters, but with the enemy. Every killed officer, every ambushed patrol, every sign of invisible presence in territory the enemy thought was secure sent the same message. We are here. You cannot see us. You cannot hear us. You cannot smell us. But we can see you. We have been watching you for hours. We will decide when you die. The decision is entirely ours. The legacy of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam, and the sniper methodology in particular, would not be fully acknowledged for decades. The official American assessment of Australian special operations was not completed until 1974, 3 years after the last Australian combat troops departed. Classified at the highest level and distributed to fewer than 50 recipients, the report reached conclusions that contradicted the fundamental assumptions of American military doctrine. Small unit operations conducted by highly trained personnel achieved better results than large unit operations supported by overwhelming firepower. Indigenous tracking methods, specifically Aboriginal techniques adapted for jungle warfare, provided intelligence capabilities that no technological system could replicate. Psychological warfare operations targeting enemy morale achieved strategic effects vastly disproportionate to the resources invested. A single 5-man patrol operating for 2 weeks could degrade enemy effectiveness more than a battalion-sized sweep-and-clear operation. The report also noted, in a classified annex, that certain Australian practices would likely violate standing American directives if conducted by American personnel. This final point, toward the report, remained buried for decades. The Pentagon had no interest in publicizing the fact that its most effective allies in Vietnam had succeeded partly by doing things American forces were prohibited from doing. But history preserves what authorities wish to forget. When the United States military finally began serious reform of its special operations capabilities in the 1980s, the reforms incorporated principles that Australians had demonstrated 2 decades earlier: emphasis on small unit tactics and individual operator judgment, prioritization of stealth and patience over firepower and aggression, the understanding that cultural adaptation and environmental integration could achieve results technology alone could not. Delta Force, the expanded SEAL teams, the entire architecture of modern American unconventional warfare, All of it carries the DNA of lessons that were available for learning in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province in 1967. The methods were demonstrated. The evidence was overwhelming. The Australians offered to teach. The institutions were not ready to learn. The men who developed and executed these methods paid prices that no casualty statistics captured. Operating at 100 meters per hour for weeks in enemy territory required a psychological transformation that left permanent marks. The constant hypervigilance could not be maintained without consequence. The absolute suppression of normal human impulses created patterns that did not reverse easily when the mission ended. Veterans described the experience of becoming something other than a conventional soldier, not metaphorically savage, but genuinely altered in how they processed the world. Human minds generate constant internal noise, plans, anxieties, memories, anticipations. This noise shapes behavior in ways that trained observers can detect. A person thinking about tomorrow moves differently than a person existing entirely in the present moment. The Australians learned to eliminate this noise, to exist in a state of pure sensory awareness for days without the normal operations of human consciousness interfering. This state made them invisible in ways that physical concealment alone could not achieve, but it was not a switch that could be flipped off when the patrol ended. Veterans reported difficulties readjusting to civilian life that exceeded standard clinical predictions. Hypervigilance persisting for years and decades, struggles with emotional openness, an inability to tolerate the noise and chaos of environments that other people navigated without thought. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. But ghosts are creatures suspended between worlds, neither fully present in one realm nor able to return to another. Some of the Australians who mastered jungle warfare found themselves similarly caught, not fully present in the civilian world they returned to, not able to forget the jungle world they had inhabited. The same transformation that made them devastating operators made them strangers in their own communities. They had learned to think like predators, and predators do not easily return to the herd. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans eventually exceeded those of their American counterparts, despite serving in smaller numbers and sustaining fewer casualties. The psychological cost of becoming what the jungle demanded was measured in lifetimes, not deployment cycles. One shot, no trace. That was the philosophy. That was the method. That was what happened when 40,000 years of tracking knowledge met modern military precision and was wielded by men who had been selected for their ability to stop being human when the situation required it. The NVA battalion commander who died at the trail junction never saw his killer. His men never found the firing position. The Australian patrol extracted from the area 2 days later, leaving nothing behind. No shell casings, no disturbed vegetation, no footprints in the soft earth. They had been there for 5 days. They might as well have been smoke. One man, one rifle, one bullet, and an entire offensive timetable shattered like glass dropped on stone. The Pentagon knew the numbers. They classified them. The enemy knew the numbers. They feared them. The survivors knew the numbers. They owed their lives to them. 1,200 patrols, 600 enemy dead, 5 Australian fatalities from all causes combined. The arithmetic of patience over firepower. The calculus of becoming what the jungle required rather than demanding the jungle accommodate what you preferred to be. 50 years later, the lessons remain relevant. Every new conflict produces variations on the same fundamental theme. technological overconfidence meeting environmental reality. Institutional assumptions colliding with conditions those assumptions cannot address. The expensive, visible way failing while the quiet, patient way succeeds. The Australians solved the problem in the rubber plantations and triple canopy jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province. They solved it with patience measured in hours, with movement measured in meters, with killing measured in single rounds fired from positions no one could find. They solved it with men who smelled like jungle rot and walked in enemy sandals and carried sawed-off rifles and full-length scoped weapons in the same five-man patrol. The institutions that ignored them spent decades learning what those men already knew. Some would argue they still have not fully learned. Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts, the men who could lie in the dirt for 11 hours and then change history with a single squeeze of a trigger. One shot, no trace, no apology, no explanation, just silence, and the echo of a war that proved patience will always outperform firepower, that one man in the right position with the right discipline can accomplish what battalions cannot, and that the most dangerous weapon ever deployed in the jungles of Vietnam was not a helicopter gunship or a B-52 bomber or a battalion of Marines. It was a man who had learned to stop breathing, stop thinking, stop existing as anything but a pair of eyes behind a scope, waiting for the 3 seconds that would make everything else irrelevant. The Viet Cong understood this before the Pentagon did. They wrote it in their operational manuals. They taught it to their officers. They warned every soldier heading into Phuoc Tuy Province, "Do not look for the Australians. You will not find them, but they have already found you." That was not propaganda. That was not bravado. That was the operational reality of a war fought by men who had mastered the oldest art of killing on earth, the art of the patient hunter, and applied it with modern weapons against a modern enemy in the most unforgiving terrain the Cold War produced. They did it with five-man patrols and single bullets, and the kind of discipline that most soldiers cannot imagine and most civilians cannot comprehend. They did it at a cost to themselves that would only become apparent decades later, when the jungle ghosts came home and discovered that the world they had left behind no longer felt like home. But in that moment, in the rubber plantation, with 300 enemy soldiers frozen in confusion around the body of their dead commander, and a single Australian marksman lying unseen in a depression 600 meters away, the equation was settled. Patience had defeated numbers. Precision had defeated firepower. One man with one rifle had done what the most powerful military machine in human history had spent years failing to accomplish. One shot, no trace. The jungle remembered. The Pentagon eventually learned. The enemy never forgot.